You're listening to the Morphology Podcast. Thanks for tuning in to the Morphology Podcast. Hey, if you haven't yet, please subscribe to this podcast and give it a thumbs up if it's deserving. It sure helps me out a lot. Anyway, aka Murph here to share interviews about biking experiences from cyclists who have pedaled to places all over. Each week, we will get to know new people and explore new destinations to ride your bike. As you listen to these adventures, you may wonder, why haven't I done that yet? This week, meet Henry Gold. He is the founder and director of TDA Global Cycling, which is an adventure cycling tour company with some epic bucket list expeditions available. Many years ago, Henry had a crazy vision to create Tour d'Afrique, a test of mind, body, and bicycle. It was to be a bicycle race in Africa, which takes cyclists north to south, from the pyramids of Giza to Cape Town. This dream became a reality in 2003 when 33 riders saddled up for the 4-month expedition. Tour d'Afrique still exists today as a popular tour, along with many other options for the cycling adventurer. Oh, and Henry tells this amazing story of how he came face to face with an angry elephant and lived to tell about it. Here's my interview with Henry. All right, well, on the podcast today, we have Henry Gold. Hey, Henry.
Hi.
And so I have done some research on you, Henry, and you are quite an inspiring person. You have done all kinds of world cycling adventures.
Yes, I've had quite an eventful life, even before I started cycling. And I say that because, in a way, the company that I set up came as a result of some of my other work. So I have been very, very fortunate and had very, very interesting adventures in life. Let's put it this way.
Yeah, and you touched on it just now, but you founded a company, TDA Global Cycling, and that's one of the reasons you're on the podcast today. Is you've been kind of expanding and adding tours, and I definitely want to get into that. First off, let me ask you where you live now and what the cycling culture is like.
So I live in Toronto, Canada. I've been here essentially on and off now, 40 years plus, and it's the home base. And the cycling culture, well, it's not as good as some of the other Canadian cities, as for example Montreal or Vancouver, but it's evolving. It's been a slow process, and been a lot of obstacles. But yeah, they're adding bike lanes and the culture is evolving. People like me are extremely impatient because I have been involved in the transportation and environmental issues for many, many years beside the company. So it's very difficult to see how slowly these things happen. But it's evolving.
It's like that where I live too, where you'll see it on paper, a new trail's coming or a new infrastructure that's going to be helpful for bicycles and pedestrians. And then you'll look at the date and they'll say, in the next 10 years, we'll have this. And it's like, oh man, it's not what I was thinking.
Yes, and those 10 years can stretch.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That's exactly the problem.
Yeah.
That is the problem.
Well, I know that you have cycled in many, many countries, and I'm sure we will get into Africa in a little bit here. But what have you noticed is the difference when you're in other countries, or maybe you want to mention some of the countries that you've pedaled your bike?
Well, by definition, if you will, every country is different, every culture is different, every culture looks at cycling differently, and that's part of the beauty of traveling. You discover new things. So we all know countries like Denmark and Holland and other Scandinavian countries are much more cycling oriented. Europe has gone quite cycling oriented. Other places, Africa has really very little cycling. Partially, well, certainly there was no infrastructure, and for most people, even having a bicycle was an expense they couldn't afford, and certainly there was no subsidies or helping people to do it. other countries are just so populated, it's difficult for cycling. But in some way, it's even better. It is good for cycling because the traffic is not moving fast, and you're not intimidated. And you can get on a bicycle, and there are local people. India, for example, plenty of cycling. China used to be a cycling haven, and many years ago, I already say many years ago, I think over 12 years ago or so, I wrote a piece here for a Canadian newspaper called Kingdom of Bicycles No More. And so, it's, every country is different. We did a amazing trip to Indonesia many years ago. And it was an amazing trip because we were forced by nature of the traffic and narrow roads and amazing, just traffic that you couldn't move. You were stuck for hours. So we were forced essentially to go on narrow country abandoned mountainous road. And as a result, we were so off the beaten road. It was just an amazing trip. It was probably one of my favorite because it had no bicycle culture whatsoever and because of the traffic and lack of infrastructure. So, it varies.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there a particular place that you would highly recommend people go with a bicycle?
The key question. I don't have an answer. I never have an answer for this because my answer usually say, I get a kick out of getting on a bicycle, even in Toronto and going to areas that I haven't been to or I haven't been for a long time and just discovering new things that I find fascinating. To me, getting on a bicycle is the act that gives me so much pleasure. Even in bad weather where I don't feel like it, and I feel, why are you going to cycling? Why are you going to do this? And then 2 minutes later, I'm on a bicycle. I say, wow, I'm so glad I pulled myself out of the warm house. So, no, my recommendation to everybody is just go out, just do anywhere. You're gonna start feeling so much better. A few minutes being on a bicycle, you're already gonna feel much better than you are sitting at home.
Oh, for sure. I definitely agree with that. I was reading different things about you, and it was way back in the 80s that you kind of started that feeling of having the company and getting bicycles for people. Where do you think your passion for bicycling comes from?
I'm a convert in many ways. When I say convert, I grew up with a bicycle in eastern Slovakia. But it was just, as a child, you go around, and I lived in a small place and visiting villages, and nearby we were just cycling. And I remember going to pick up mineral water, which was 5 kilometers away from where I lived, and on a regular basis we go and pick up, natural spring, and we would just go with 6, 7, 8 bottles and fill them up and come back. So yes, in that sense, I grew up with a bicycle. But as far as you became an adult, I emigrated twice to different countries. Bicycle was not part of it. And then later on, when I did have a bicycle, it was mainly for commuting. I did live in Banff, Canada, one long summer, and there I bought myself a bicycle, and there I would do day journeys, kind of into the parks and so on. But it wasn't even. I would hardly take any food with me. It was just kind of a few hours. That was the essence of it. And then I got interested in transportation issues, and I was more interested in cycling as an alternative to pollution. I'm an engineer by training, and in fact, my first job was anti-pollution engineer. And so my interest in bicycle came from the fact that this compared to everything else, cycling is such a benign way of for the environment. Compared to cars and buses and trains and certainly planes. And so I was interested in bicycle as a transportation. And in fact, that's what eventually led me to set up a company, because I was actually working in Africa. I was running a non-for-profit organization, which I co-started with a friend of mine, a doctor. And we were working in Africa, and I kept seeing this incredible weight people carried on their backs, and the lack of if you produce something, you couldn't take it to the market more than what you could carry either on a horse or on your back. And I said, what Africa needed sort of a China in those days had bicycles. India had those bicycles. I said, and there were some of those bicycles, but by the time you get an Indian or Chinese bicycle, which would cost, I don't know, in India, $30 or $40, by the time you were selling it in Nairobi, it would be costing $200.
Oh, wow.
And who could afford those? So I said to myself, there's got to be a solution here. Somebody's got to bring the price down. And I found that, in fact, someone approached me who wanted to work for my organization, and he had an MBA, and I said, listen, forget about working my organization. I have another idea. Let's try to set up a factory in Nairobi to lower the prices of bicycles and to create an African bike. And he liked the concept, and I was able to raise some money, so I sent him to Nairobi to do a feasibility study, and the feasibility study looked promising, and we decided we're going to set up a company, we're going to do this. And the concept of the Tour d'Afrique bicycle was, one day we were struggling, how are we going to market it? We have no money, we have no backup, we have nothing. So how are you going to market all this? And I said to him very simply, you know what, I have this crazy idea. We're going to set up a crazy bicycle race across Africa, Cairo to Cape Town. And because it's going to be so crazy, because it's never been done, because it's going to be using our own bicycle, crazy, heavy bicycle, the media will love it. They'll be loved following it as we go through it. I thought of Bronson, the UK guy who came up with all sorts of stunts to market himself and his companies, Virgin Airlines and stuff. You know him, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I sort of said, I saw that kind of an image in front of me. We're going to do something very, very crazy. I mean, we're going to call it Tour d'Afrique, Cairo to Cape Town, Tour de France, Tour d'Afrique. And that was the idea where setting up the company came from. My colleague, unfortunately, got cold feet and took a job with a consulting company. And I was involved. I was still running my non-for-profit organization. I was at that time also involved in producing documentary films about Africa. And I had to make a choice. I couldn't leave I had to make a choice. What I'm going to do? Am I going to go to a completely new venture called, manufacturing bicycles, or am I going to keep doing what I already was doing, which was hard enough in itself. You start something from scratch, boy, it takes, and you have commitment to all sorts of people. So I said, let's put this aside. I'm not going to deal with this right now, the manufacturing of bicycles. But a few months later, somebody introduced me to this Canadian Dutch guy who was an avid cyclist, a racer, in fact, and he just spent some time in Africa himself, and he loved the concept of a bicycle race across Africa. He didn't want to he was actually in cycling business already, and he just didn't want to get into the manufacturing. So we talked about it, and I said, and he convinced me. I said, okay, let's do this Tour d'Afrique. It was in 1993 or 94. And I was still working, on my other projects. But then there was a terrible terrorist attack in Egypt. I think about 50 or 60 people were killed, tourists. And we sat down together and decided, the timing is not right. Who's going to go? This was in some of those first big terrorist acts where the impact was so huge. We realized that Egypt for a year or two,
right.
is just not a go. So they put it aside, and then that was it. And for years, he got into a very serious car accident, and I left my job and overseas for a few years. It was kind of back and forth. We would talk on the phone once a year or so. But then in 2002, I had another project, a competition with World Bank, which failed because of 9/11, meaning it just didn't happen because of 9/11. And so I called that fellow and I said, I'm 50. If I'm going to do some crazy stuff, it has to be now.
Now is the time.
Now or never.
Right.
Now or never.
Right.
I think if I recall correctly, he said, let me get back to you in a day or two. And he basically said, yes, let's do it. And I think that was about February 2002, or March. And by by mid-January in 2003, myself, him, and another 31 cyclists and support staff, additional support staff, we were standing in front of the pyramids and under the starting gate. So that's how the company was set up. That's where it came. As I said, the kind of the origin is kind of long-winded, and then I just became a convert. Meaning, boy, I just discovered that this is everything I was talking about in the past. It just started coming all together, including, by the way, trying to help Africa, because the whole concept of going to Africa was to bring people to experience Africa in a different way than most people who come to Africa would. And I mean by that most people who came to Africa would be either going on safaris and staying in fancy lodges, or coming to work there, like myself, where they were dealing with all the challenges Africa, with the misery, the poverty, the hunger, or they were businessmen who came to exploit Africa. There was really no other way of experiencing Africa. Maybe if you went to South Africa, there was much more of a tourism there, but and Egypt, of course, had its own historical tourism. There's plenty of that, but the rest of Africa was an unknown territory, and I said, this is, cycling is one different way of seeing and approach and seeing and experiencing Africa, and there was tremendous cynicism and skepticism. People didn't believe this was doable. People that came on our first trip, some of them were convinced they're going to die on this trip.
Oh, wow.
They were just like the old type explorer who just said, I'm going to go for it, but I think I'm going to die here. The perception of Africa was just so different. Even now it's still there, but certainly not to the extent. And as I said, my friends, when I mentioned I'm doing this, they said, Henry, you flipped. You completely flipped. This is crazy. It's not doable. You don't know what you're taking on. You have no experience in any of this. And they were right. I had no experience in any of this. But what I did have experience was that I knew that Africa is not what people thought it was. And that's essentially how it came about.
So when you're talking about the Tour d'Afrique, I hope I'm saying that right.
Tour d'Afrique, yeah.
Tour d'Afrique.
Yeah. Okay.
You have that dream of, I'm going to ride my bike across Africa and I want other people to join me. I'm assuming at that point there was no bicycle routes. There was no, of course you had a plan, but your dream became reality, and it's just mind-blowing to think you did it.
Yeah, it was an adventure almost in a kind of the 19th century sense, where you didn't know what you were getting yourself into. It wasn't unknown in the sense that there were local people who on every section knew what's there, but nobody had the kind of a knowledge that would cover top to bottom, and certainly certain sections were unknown to foreigners for sure. There were zones that were really literally not open to foreigners. There were military zones and political issues, so they were banning foreigners from them, etc. So we, when we announced it, I had no guarantee that we were actually be even allowed to go through this. But what I did know, and this is the advantage that came in, some of the most difficult places, I worked in those places, in those countries anyway, and I developed some local contacts, and I thought in 2002, I thought the situation is changing and this is feasible. I think I can do it with a little luck and the help of my connected friends. I could do this, and it worked out. It's exactly what worked out. Anybody who have not had that history in those countries would probably not been allowed to go through it. But because people knew me, because they realized what kind of support type of aid I brought into the country, they were not questioning my motives, and perhaps even they didn't understand what I was trying to do. So sometimes it's better too. But as I said, I managed to get the permits very easily, frankly. And I say very easily just because I contacted through internet. I contacted my old friends, if you will, there, and I said, listen, you may have heard me talking about this in the past. I want to do this can you help me get the permits? And I think 3 or 4 of the difficult places, I literally got a response saying, "And then don't worry about it, we'll get it for you."
Wow. Wow.
Uh, and I think that's what made Tour de Afrique happen. It's just literally that, how you never know where, the things you do, how it can help you in the future.
Sure. Well, we should mention the name of the company is TDA Global Cycling, and it's pretty simple to find online. It's just tdaglobalcycling.com. But can you go from, that first expedition to now you are a full-fledged touring company?
Again, there was no original vision that that's what we were going to do. In fact, I think it was almost in the last few days of the Tour de Afrique when we were already in South Africa, and we were assured that unless something crazy happens, we were going to make it. I was cycling. I was a slow cyclist. I was always in the back, and there would be 3 or 4 people hanging around with me partially because we were slow by definition. Like me, I'm not a fast cyclist, but partially because we stopped and enjoyed ourselves and talked to the locals and had more fun than people who were trying to go from point A to point B very fast. So one of them at some point says, "Oh, Henry, okay, we made it to South Africa. We made it. What's next?" And I just blurted out something out of my mind. I said, "Well, obviously the next big trip is Silk Route. Nobody Silk Route is legendary." And I just said Silk Route, and that sort of started thinking that rather than just keep doing this, both from a business sense, if this company is going to exist for a long time, it needs to diversify, but also because that's where my heart lies. I love going to new places and exploring. I certainly love the way we did it on a bicycle. I'm not a very good tourist, but I go to places because I have to have some sort of a goal, and crossing a country on a bicycle is a goal. And in that sense, that gives me the motivation. I think a lot of people are like myself, and that's how it started. So started thinking. We didn't do the next trip was not so cool. The next trip was actually a trip in Europe we did a trip from Paris to Istanbul, which is again we sort of follow the old traditional route of the Orient Express train. The Orient Express mystery movies and books, etc. Well, the Orient Express was a real train, and I thought, well, rather than do something as challenging as Silk Route the second, let's try doing this European one. It should be easy. And so that was the second one, and then the next one was the Silk Route 2 years later, and then every year or two we would add another adventure. The next one would be at that time called the South American Epic, which is different than what the one we have right now. And we just kept adding. At this point, I think if you go on our website, you'll see at least a dozen different trips. Some of them are super epics, very long trip. Like the South American trip right now is from Cartagena in Colombia all the way to the bottom tip of South America, Ushuaia, Argentina. That's a 5.5-month trip, 5.5 months on a bicycle. We now have another great one that starts on top of Canada and goes all the way to Panama City.
Oh, wow.
That's a North American epic. We have something called Trans-Europa. We have a trip in Far East called Bamboo Route. And we have shorter trips that we do as well right now. And they're all different not different, but we have sort of divided our trips into 4 different categories. The real big one, challenging expeditions, are expeditions. Then we have something called adventure, which is more like the Bamboo Route in Southeast Asia. Then we have what we call more touring type, which is the European trips and some other ones. And now we started experimenting with doing a supported bikepacking, we call it.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not really supported in a true sense, but it just gives people an opportunity to try bikepacking with some support. It's essentially based on when I set up the Tour de Afrique, it was the assumption that many people, most people will never go on a trip across Africa if they don't have some support. It's just too much of a challenge, and there are people who always cycling. 150 years ago, people were on a bicycle around the world, but those are unique individuals. The majority of people would love to go to Africa or anywhere else around the world, but they won't go by themselves. A variety of reasons. Maybe they're older now. Maybe they need some, they don't have the confidence for emergencies. Maybe they're worried about crossing borders, etc. So the idea was that we create a support, and different trips have different type of support. So the same concept, we are looking into bikepacking. A lot of young people go on bikepacking, and they don't need any help. Those are kind of the elite, the top of the pyramid. They can do things by themselves. But most of us are not. We are not elite athletes. We are not elite adventurers.
Or you don't want to be. You're just like, I
or
want
you
to
don't
go
want
enjoy.
To be.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we are experimenting with this bikepacking now to find a formula that works. So again, people like myself, I'm 69. I still love to go bikepacking, but by going by myself, or even if finding a friend at my age to go, it's just essentially a no-go.
Yeah.
But if I can find 6, 7, 8 people and that want to go into on a bikepacking trip and support each other and help, and have maybe a guide who can show us how to do things better and easier and so on, and certainly when we get hurt or something, then they can help us. So this is the sort of thing we're looking at right now.
Yeah, and what better way to do it than, like you said, to have 8 to 10 or whatever like-minded people. Even though they maybe found this on a website or via some sort of word of mouth, but yet they have the same mindset versus trying to get your spouse or a friend who maybe doesn't bike and probably will not enjoy it as much as you. So I think that's pretty cool. I also noticed on the website, when you say the word support, it can mean so many different things. So if people want to, like you mentioned, bike packing, where they bring all their stuff on their own bike, versus maybe somebody who wants to stay in a hotel or have an actual bed or have food prepared for them. Like you offer such a great variety.
Yeah, exactly. I always look at myself as an example. I don't mind being pampered once in a while.
Right.
But at the same time, I really enjoy the challenge of doing something difficult and challenging, so we have a cross section. As I said, expedition are the most challenging ones. The touring get much more support. We stay in nice hotels.
Mm-hmm.
The places we go to are not necessarily very challenging in the sense of when I compare it to some of the African countries or even some of the Asian countries we go to. That's a kind of a variety we offer.
A quick interruption to give a shout out to Primal Wear. Cycling is their passion and apparel is their craft. So if you are in the market for a new jersey, bibs, mask, or any cycling apparel, go to primalwear.com and use code PRIMALMURPH to get 20% off your purchase. Yes, 20%. Now back to the show. Okay, so I want to switch topics real quick here, but I can't believe that, you are still sitting here talking to me, because there was a point in your life when you were out on your bicycle and you happened upon an angry elephant. And I'm talking about a real elephant. And you almost lost your life, right?
Yes, well, there's an irony in all of this, because for years now we were doing this trips in Africa and Silk Route and South America. We all have these preconceived notions, and the number one question always was, is it safe? Is it safe? Is it safe? And usually when people mean is it safe, they worry about things like wild animals and like being killed by terrorists and so on. And I would always tell them, don't worry about snakes, don't worry about the wild animals, don't worry about any of it. Don't worry about terrorists, don't worry about wars, don't worry about anything. The only thing you have to worry about is crazy drivers, traffic. And I would look at it, I wrote blogs about it. I said, just statistically, I'm an engineer, I look at things and I try to see the reality of it. And the reality of it, your chances of being hurt or killed by any of those other things compared to being killed by a car are huge.
Mm-hmm.
It's huge. There's no comparison. Yet we all seem to accept that the car could kill us, but we worry about the snake.
Right.
So I go back. I say it was ironic that what happened to me then, I was the one who were actually, literally, from all these years of we went through, the only real animal attack, if you will, and an injury was caused to me by an elephant, and it was totally innocent. I was on a bicycle in southern India between two national parks. We had a trip there. I was the suite. There was one rider. She was American. We just started the day. We were, I think, about 5-6 miles into the ride. Me and her were behind because she was having our style of cycling is everybody goes in their own pace, and you get up, you have your breakfast, and you go. So some go right away, some can wait, some are slow like me, some go to the toilet for a few minutes, and so on. But anyway, she was having a problem with the bicycle, so I was hanging back with her, and then we got going eventually, about 5-6 miles into the ride from a very lovely lodge we were staying in, going through a forest. We're going uphill, and in front of her, about, I don't know, 50, 100 yards in front of her, I saw a mother elephant with two young ones crossing the road all of a sudden. And she was with me in Africa years before. And we go through a section in Africa, which we call elephant highways, because there's a lot of elephants there. And everybody saw an elephant except her. And so as I saw the elephant in front, I said, wow, what an irony. What a nice
you
thing.
get to see it.
She's not enjoying it. she gets to see the elephant, and she has never seen him in Africa. And we kept both, the elephants were peaceful, they crossed very peacefully, and she kept going ahead of me, and I was going after her slowly. In my mind, I was sort of looking to the left where the elephant went into the forest, wondering if I can catch a glimpse of the elephant. And whatever it took, that 100 yards or so cycling up the hill, when I got to the point, I said, well, I don't see anything. I must have already passed them, or the elephant is already deep in the in the forest. And as that thought crossed me, all of a sudden, this full speed just broke through the trees, the elephant charging me, going at me. And when they run the speed of a horse. So I made a very quick decision that the only way I can get away was trying to turn around and go downhill. I tried to do that, but it was a kind of a one-lane paved road, but the shoulder was like, at least 6 inches from the pavement. So I had to try to make a very narrow turn. It didn't work. I fell, at which point, my brain suggested very quickly, try to get into the forest and try to zigzag in the trees. So I made a very quick choice. You don't have this, your mind takes over very quickly. And the choice was to run slightly in the direction where the elephant was coming, but not right at the elephant, but about 45 degrees. So the elephant would have to make a sharp turn, and that would slow her and gives me time to sort of get into the forest and zigzag. So this part actually worked. I managed to get into the forest, and I heard the elephant actually stop stepping on a bicycle, crashing the bicycle. And then I was already making another zigzag turn when I felt something grabbing me by the ankle, which was the trunk of the elephant, and I was in the air. So the next thought as I fell to the ground was trying to put myself into fetal position, trying to limit the space the elephant had. This is, the Canadians, we get trained about how to deal with bears.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So that was the thought, and the next thing that happened was that I heard the helmet cracking from the force of the elephant's foot on my head, and at which point, interesting enough, the thought that crossed my mind simply was like, this is very interesting, what happens next.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was an amazing calm, actually. I to this day, I just don't know how it happened. It was tremendous calm, that there was no acceptance, maybe. Just this is it. This is the way it goes, yeah, what happens next? And then I either lost consciousness or the brain basically deleted the next whatever time it took. But when the next realization was I was now flat on my back, and the elephant was already disappearing in the forest. She was running away from it. I think it was she because of the elephant, but it could have been a male who was just, apparently there's tradition that the male always watches the family. So it could have been a male who watched the female with the young ones. I just trying to figure out what to do next because I was convinced I had a broken leg somehow, and it turned I did have a bunch of broken bones, and I was in a serious situation, serious condition.
Mm-hmm.
But as to what, how many times she stepped on me, obviously she stepped on, beside my helmet, she stepped on other parts of my body because my arm was completely disfigured. I had a broken bone sticking from my upper arm. Wow. I had shoulder broken. I had my wrist was broken in two places. I had a crack, lower back. I had the orbital bone cracked. There was a bunch of injuries. My ribs were cracked. So she either twisted me around. She definitely stepped on me at least once. But maybe the helmet cracking basically thought, well, she basically thought maybe that was it, and I was done. So she abandoned me. I don't know. I'm very fortunate,
Yes.
literally very fortunate, that I had more or less a full recovery. Fortunately for me, I never suffered any PTSD as well. Perhaps because I was willing to talk about it right away. I wrote a blog about it. The whole idea where I mentioned it for years. I tell everybody not to worry about wild elephant, and here, ironically, but wild animals, and here, ironically, here's the person I said, this is the blog is going to be written about things you never should worry about on this trip. And the blog was written 4 or 5 days. I was still in bed in the hospital, writing with one finger. But yeah, I'm very extremely fortunate.
Yeah, and it's nice to be able to tell that story and know that, yes, you got back on a bicycle and you've probably seen an elephant since then.
Oh, I tested myself right away. Not right away, but that summer, I was still I didn't heal right away. I had to have I had an operation in the same evening, but I then had to have another operation a year later in Canada. So the recovery was much longer than originally expected. But I do recall, I have 2 nieces in Washington D.C. And I went to visit them, visit my sister and the family there too. And the older niece, for some reason, decided to take me to a zoo in Washington.
Oh no!
and of course, she decided to take me in front of the elephant. So that was the first time I saw. But since then, I have seen them literally in the wilderness, and I was certainly having awareness of elephants, and I was curious to see how I would react. So I react. I was fine. I was calm, and it makes you aware when you look at those elephants. I was on a safari in Tanzania, where in a vehicle, of course, but the elephant was like 6 feet away from me, looking at me, and I kept thinking, is there a way to communicate with each other?
It's already been done. You don't have to come get me.
Because we were looking at it with such intensity, and I was just wondering, well, this is interesting.
Oh, wow.
I did recall an interesting story. I don't know if you want to hear this about Lauren Munderpost. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he's a South African writer who grew up near the Kalahari Desert. And as a young man, he was a bit of a hunter, and he tells a story how he killed a lion in South Africa. But years later, he was in London in a zoo, and when he walked by the cage of a lion, he said all of a sudden the lion just got very intense and angry and literally jumped at the fence. And he wrote about it. Well, is there some sort of a subliminal communication?
Right.
and that kind of a thought crossed my mind when Alison was looking at me with such intensity. But anyways, I said I was in the car, so I wasn't panicking. I was sort of on the top. You know how you go on a safari, you stand and you watch.
Yeah.
So we were. I mean, he could have reached me with his trunk if he wanted, but. Yeah, fortunately, no PTSD, and I think part of the reason is because I was willing to write about it and talk about it right away. I am a strong believer. I had a mom who survived 3 years of concentration camps, and she talked about it even in my childhood. And I think one of the reasons she was able to live a normal life because she was willing to share the horrible stories.
Oh, man. A quick interruption to tell you this week's podcast is sponsored by Lizard Lips Lip Balm. These great lip balms contain natural ingredients, come in a variety of flavors, and you can choose certified organic or balms with sun protection. Check it out at lizardlips.net. Now back to the show. Are there any cycling expeditions that are really memorable to you that you want to share with our listeners?
Well, I think every trip is memorable for different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you get different things out of them. As I said before at the beginning, every time I go on a bicycle, you know, it's a joy for me. Yeah, you know, doing any first crossing of a country or a continent is always very very memorable. Of course, you know, the African trip is the most memorable. It's you know, it's like your first love. You never forget that.
Yeah.
But you know, the more challenging the trips, the more memorable they are. You know, again, I have written blogs about stretching yourself and seek discomfort, and because you know, you most learn when you are challenged. Whether you know, a year and a half ago, for the first time, we had a trip in the Himalayas from Kashmir to Kathmandu. And it's sort of, you know, we call it the Trans-Himalaya, even though it's not necessarily crossing Himalaya, but it does go on several occasions. We go through elevation, which is over 5,000 meters, which I believe is, 17,000 feet. And, you know, when I was doing this, before I did this, first of all, I scouted it with an Indian fellow who works with us, who's actually, he pitched the idea to us. And when I was in the car, I realized, well, how am I going to cycle this? You know, I'm going to be 67 years old. How am I going to get to 5,000 meters up? I mean,
Right.
you know, it just sounds insane. But I said, you know, I committed myself. I scouted it. I'm going to do this. And, you know, when I managed to do these days, when I managed to cross on a day, on these difficult, challenging day, 5,000 meters plus on a bicycle, it was hell of a challenge, but boy, what a satisfaction, what joy afterwards, you know, what the in a sense of both experiencing the high altitude of the mountains around you, but the challenge, the difficulty of breathing and keep going and not giving up and saying, you know, I'm going to do this no matter what. Not this, I don't care about the snow and the rain. And by the way, going to the top over 5,000 meters on one day, we had it all. We had sunny, you know, and it would change every 10 minutes. You had beautiful sun, and next thing you had a snowstorm, and the next thing you had, you know, you had ice falling on you, and you name it. And you just don't give up. You know, there's the vehicle you want to get into, although the vehicle has a hard time too, because the road is terrible. You know, the paved road falls apart very quickly in this sort of situation. So even though every year they do the repairs, it just falls apart. But, you know, so crossing trips like this, or you know, going on a Silk Route, which is legendary, or the African Mountain, South American places I have always heard about, and all of a sudden being there on a bicycle, you know, it gives you such sense of satisfaction and enriching you. It's continuously enriching you because you learn continuously. Sometimes from people you don't expect to, sometimes because of the book you pick up, sometimes because of other people who are around you, who are talking about it, who are much more knowledgeable about it, and so on. And because you are searching, you are now into something and something doesn't make sense to you, or you're trying to understand something, or whatever, you know, South American history, for example, indigenous people, you know, all of a sudden subject that I may have had very superficial interest in, all of a sudden they become very interesting because they are, it's right in front of you.
Yeah. And I agree with you on, you know, finding the most challenging adventures or expeditions you go on. We call that type 2 fun, where it's kind of miserable and you just think you can't do it while it's happening. But then, in retrospect, you're like, all right, that was good. I did it. It was fun. I would recommend it.
Yeah, no, as I said, I'm a convert. I write about it on our blog. If you search on my blog, you will find all kinds of issues about how to live well. It's essentially by pushing yourself a little bit extra, by taking, by doing you don't feel like it,
Yeah.
by getting out on a bicycle on a rainy day, and all of a sudden I find a real joy when the water is coming down my face. Is it comfortable? Initially, definitely not.
Right.
Is it comfortable if I get wet, really soaking wet? No. But at the end of it, your body is stimulated, your mind is stimulated by this kind of condition.
Yeah.
Lying on a beach is not stimulating unless you ogle the people.
True. Back to the original expedition. Does that still exist, or a version of it still exist?
Oh, yeah, no, it's an annual event, except this past year we missed it because of the COVID, obviously.
Sure.
It's our most iconic trip and most well-known. There's been several books now, both by our riders, but even people have set up iconic trips you must do in your lifetime, whether it's National, The Lonely Planet, or other people have written. It's actually usually the number one trip that is mentioned in the book.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it has become very iconic, and a lot of people are dreaming about it. So it does exist. We have set it up for next year, next January. There's already quite a few people signed up for it. So yeah, it certainly exists. Most of our trip we try to do over and over again. The African one we do every year, and most of the other we do every second or even third year, because just the challenge of it and getting critical mass of participants to do it. So the South American epic, the North American epic, we now do every 3 years. And some of the other trips we do every 2 years. So it just depends on the number of participants. But we try to do all of those. The only one that we don't do is Indonesia, because no matter how wonderful the trip was, Indonesia doesn't seem to attract people. I don't get it. As I said, it was one of my favorite trips, and yet maybe because there's too much climbing. Lots of very steep climbing.
Yeah, well, that sounds a little intimidating. That's a lot of, those are a lot of kilometers. Yeah. What do you see on the horizon or the future for your company? As COVID still exists, but it seems to be getting to the point where we're getting a handle on it. So where do you see the future of your company?
Well, I think we would like to keep on doing what we're doing and do more of it and get more people involved. We have new trips, for example, this year coming up because of COVID particularly, but even before we had plans. We have a Southern USA trip, which is a little different than most trips. And then again, that's where we differ. Even if we do a trip either Europe or US or Canada, we try to do a more different route than a traditional, not necessarily the most direct route, but the one that we think has more highlights. So we have a trip coming up in September to Southern USA from California to Georgia, from coast to coast. Again, it's a little different than the typical U.S. trips. We had the trip planned for across Canada this year, but that's not going to work out because of COVID. So we have a trip on the western part in British Columbia, and we call beautiful British Columbia, and then we have a trip kissing the cut on the eastern part of Canada. And again, they are later in the year because by then I think most people will be vaccinated and the border will be hopefully open and we'll be able to do it. In fact, people are registering for both of those trips already and the U.S. trip. We still have trips in U.S. in Europe for this year. Whether they will happen, I don't know. But we do have one. We have this Trans-Europa trip, which originally was supposed to start in St. Petersburg, but it's now going to be starting in Tallinn, Estonia. But we may not be able to do it. We may only end up doing part of it. We'll see how the COVID situation. And then we have other trips also planned later in the year. We have an amazing trip called Patagonia Adventure. That's a wonderful, wonderful trip. That's really in November. So again, by then we hope things are more or less doable. We have other trips. I don't know whether it's doable. Again, wonderful trips in Turkey called Seven Wonders of Turkey. we have a trip in Madagascar, which I did a year and a half ago, which was also amazing trip. Lovely 5 week, 6 weeks trip in Madagascar. Again, we don't know situation, COVID. We do have a bamboo trip as well this year. That's another one that because it crosses many boundaries, it's questionable. I think just because it's one thing to be able to do one country like U.S. or Canada, but if you start putting too many countries, that's why Patagonia is doable because it's essentially Chile. But I don't know about bamboo, whether that's going to be durable or not. So that's for this year. And for next year, well, if things go to normal, we'll have the Tour d'Afrique, we'll have the Silk Route, we have the South American Epic on the plan, North American Epic. We have a very large calendar for next year. Again, depends on how things evolve. So that's about, the company has plenty of trips. There is no lack of ideas to do amazing trips. It always depends on the reality. What we're very good, exceptionally good at, as I may say so, and in fact, that's what separates us from anybody else, is the ability to deal with new situations, with logistics, with crossing. Just like I was very lucky to get those permits across Africa. We have the skills and the experience how to do just about anything, anywhere in the world. The scope of our trip before COVID would cover more than 80 countries of cycling. And we are unafraid of coming to a new country, new culture, new language. We have the ability. I sometimes joke around that we are really a logistic company that happen to be cycling.
Right.
Because our ability to go into new countries, new cultures, I don't think is comparable to anybody out there. And the experience that we have accumulated, the contacts we have, just the general knowledge and so on. So, we'll keep doing that. If COVID forces us into different changes, well, we'll explore those. See what direction we will go. We don't plan to close down. Just because we're having too much fun.
Right. Well, I was going to say you have all these adventures, and I'm assuming that you go on some of them still, which, I mean, that's the perfect.
Absolutely. I love being there. I would go on 3 or 4 adventures every year if things work out. As I said, to me, it's extremely stimulating. And I'm aging, but the best way to deal with age is to continue to expose yourself and challenge yourself, and every gerontologist will tell you that that's the way, whether it's learning a new language or going on a great adventure or reading a book. Those are the way to deal with as you age. And my mom passed away at the age of 91 plus, and 6 weeks before she passed away, in fact, when I took her to emergency hospital, she was telling the doctor, "I got to be out of here because I have a trip in 6 weeks. I got to go on."
Oh my goodness!
and she booked her own trip. She did all the arrangements. So I'll never forget that moment. That she was going to an emergency and she was telling the doctor, I got to be out of here very quickly because I have a trip to go to. So,
oh my goodness.
My mom is the model, and if I can do that, then that's the way to live your life.
Well, it definitely sounds like you're already on the correct path to duplicate that.
I don't know. Just like the elephant, you never know what next minute's going to bring you.
Yeah,
but,
you're right.
But again, the lesson from my mother. She lost her family, a huge tragedy. But at the end, she always took advantage of what was offered to her. She had a very difficult life, but boy, oh boy, she knew how to take advantage of every minute when it was offered to her. And I think that's how we all have to look at it. We just don't know. It's COVID or something else. We don't know. And as a result, you plan for what you can, you learn from what you can, and just be positive and do it.
Well said. That's a great way to end this podcast interview. Do you want to tell the people your social media sites or your website one more time?
Sure. So, the company is called TDA, as in Tom, David Atlas, globalcycling.com. We do have a Facebook page. We have an Instagram page. We have a YouTube page. There's a lot of information. Even if you're not interested in us in general, but you're interested in doing your own trips, if you're willing to, you'll find every information you just about need on going to places. So yeah, and if you're interested in our trips, you can always call us. Phone number 416-364-8255. Leave a message. We have a person who gets back to you. Yeah, so any information you have or any suggestion, ideas, or thoughts, we're always open. I think in general we are quite a open company. We have people who work for us in different countries, so again, a lot of information available there.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Henry, so much for coming on the show. And I look forward to keeping my eye on TDA Global Cycling. And, of course, one of those trips are on my bucket list. So one of these years.
Okay. It would be great to meet in person.
Yes. Awesome. Well, thanks, Henry.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Well, that's it for this week. A huge thank you to Henry for taking the time to talk about TD Global Cycling and his cycling adventures. Be sure to go to tdaglobalcycling.com. There is so much information, inspiration, and tour options available. And consider me available if you need someone to go on one of those tours with you. If you have a topic or the name of a cyclist you find interesting, email me at morphologypodcast@gmail.com. Please visit my Instagram page for daily entertainment and check out Morphology YouTube page to find videos of some of the places I go with my bike. I'll leave you with this quote from the Unwritten Book of Morphology, and this quote comes from today's guest, Henry Gold. The more challenging the trip, the more memorable it is. You learn the most when you are challenged. Think about it.